Shalom. I am Rabbi Nathan Davidovich speaking to you on behalf of the webyeshiva.org. I'm going to speak today about this week's Parsha, which is Parsha Chukas. And there's a very strange commandment in it. And it's the commandment of the Porah Aduma, the red heifer. And we're going to talk about what we learn from this strange commandment. Let me tell you how the Torah sets it up and begins. It starts out, Zos Chukas Torah. It's talking about the red heifer, but it says this is the law of the Torah. What was the law of the poradom of the red heifer? A red heifer was that had never been used for work, never had any load upon it, was killed by the Kohen and burned, and then the ashes were put into a mixture. And it was mixed up and a compound was created, and this compound was used to purify anybody who had become ritually impure by contact with a dead person. The interesting thing about this particular mitzvah, this commandment, is that the person, the Kohen, who's preparing this compound, after he prepares it, he becomes impure. And he's got to himself go through a purification process. Whereas the whole compound itself is the culmination of the process to purify somebody who has become ritually impure by contact with a dead person. Many questions are raised by the commentaries about this strange mitzvah. One of the questions, basic questions, is why doesn't the Torah begin the parsha by saying, instead of Zos Chukas HaTorah, this is the statute of the Torah, let it begin by saying Zos Chukas HaPara, this is the statute of the red heifer. Doesn't begin that way. And of course, this very question and the very fact that we don't know the reason for this commandment leads to people scoffing the Torah and say, what is this? You're following a commandment that has no rational reason? In fact, the reasons for this Porah Adama, this red heifer, were completely hidden from everybody. Even Solomon, the wisest of all people, said, this is beyond me. I don't understand it. So what's the message for us? And we do have a very important message for us. Again, this is not just a historical event telling us something that happened. So there's some very interesting commentaries. I just picked up a couple to talk about. The Kli Yakar, one of the commentaries that is frequently cited next to the pages in the Torah, he says there are certain statutes, certain laws that a person rationally can understand, but then there are others where the reason for the law is completely unknown to the person. Obviously, in this chapter of the Torah, we're talking about the red heifer, but there are other commandments, many other commandments, and we don't know the reason for them. One of the examples that come to mind is the laws of keeping kosher. The laws of keeping kosher are not explained rationally. Some people try to attribute health reasons to it. Nonsense. That is not the reason for the laws of keeping kosher. The laws of not eating pork or forbidden products is not because you can get a disease or get sick by eating something. It has nothing to do with it. In fact, the Torah, when it talks about the laws of kashrus, it says, you should do this because I am holy. Now the Orach Chaim, the Holy Orach Chaim, says that the language, uh, Zos Chukas HaTorah, teaches us a very moral and ethical message. And he says that whoever observes this commandment, although you don't see a reason for it, is considered as if he has observed the entire range of commandments contained in the Torah. The reason is that when we observe a commandment which is completely beyond our understanding, it is equivalent to our declaration of faith in God and His Torah. Because we're not doing it because it makes sense to do it. The problem that we run into is that if we only fulfill the mitzvahs that make sense to us on an intellectual basis, and if we measure it by the mores and the morality of the time, those commandments can change. Things that were never thought of happening 50 years ago are now commonplace. The morality and the definition of morality as given by a human being is subject to change. The morality and the definition of morality as given by God is immutable, is not subject to change. And the Torah is teaching us this mitzvah. And the Kedushas Levi, the holy Rebbe of Barditchev, he says, that the reason for this mitzvah is hidden from everybody. He says, but why do you have to do it? He says, a person must do this, and in doing this, he must think of this as any other mitzvah that he does. He does it to fulfill the tzivui Hashem alav lasot l'kayim, to fulfill the mitzvah that God gave us to do and to complete. And he goes on with this astounding statement. He says, "Rak ikur kiyum haTorah mitzvos yeh siva Hashem lemor." He says, when we do any commandment, when we fulfill any commandment of the Torah, we should not do it because it makes sense to us. We should do it for one reason, and that is to fulfill the will of God, to recognize that God is commanding us to do it, and that is why we do it. That is what it means to be a Jew and observe Torah, to accept the Torah, to understand the Torah, not to think that we have the liberty to change what God has told us. The Torah is immutable. We see so many examples in life where people try to rationalize their behavior and measure it against who knows what yardstick. But when you measure it against the Torah and you ask yourself, am I doing this mitzvah because God commanded me to do it? Or am I doing it for some selfish reason? Am I doing it for my own self enjoyment? When we make a blessing before we do something, we say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu mitzvos v'tzivanu, so on. Blessed are you, Lord our God, who commanded us, who made us holy with his commandments. We know and we say when we're doing a mitzvah that this is a way to achieve holiness, to come closer to God. That God gave us mitzvahs to become holy, not as an intellectual exercise, but to recognize that by doing this mitzvah, we can strive, in fact, to be holy. And as the Kedushas Levi said, let's look at every single one of the commandments of the Torah and our ability to do them as an example of our love for God and an example of the fact that we want to fulfill the Torah not for personal reasons, but because God told us to do so. I thank you for listening on behalf of the webyeshiva.org. I wish everybody a wonderful Shabbat, and I wish everybody to have this introspection within themselves. When they do a commandment, are they doing it because God commanded it? That's the basis. Thank you. Shabbat Shalom.